As many of you know, I like to delve into a number of intelligence sources and magazines. I'm not much into, as far as the world of prophecy is concerned, I'm much into crazy types of sensationalism. So, just because somebody writes a book or says something about a situation doesn't necessarily make it so. And also, I like to look at all the facts on the ground. And this is no different here. In fact, I just read an article at Stratfor about Iran and the direction that the future of this Iranian-Israeli situation will probably take. And here it goes right here. And it's not talking about their nuclear weapons program. This is all compounded by the question of Iranian nuclear weapons. In our view, as we have said, the Iranians are far closer to a controlled underground test than to a deliverable weapon. In other words, they're not really that close to actually being able to mount an attack on Israel with a ballistic missile. They can't place any warheads. It's highly unlikely they can place a warhead or a weapon on a missile. Israel's problem is that Iran appears on the verge of a strategic realignment in the region. And what they're saying is basically that Iran is beginning to scare different nations into leaning toward them because they're afraid they're about ready to go nuclear and they don't want to be the odd man out. The sense that Iran is an emerging nuclear power both enhances Iran's position and decreases anyone's appetite to do anything about it. And this is one of the reasons why I feel that the United States will likely allow Iran to get their nuclear weapon and sort it out as time goes on. In other words, I think we're going to have to just live with Iran becoming a nuclear power. Israel is practicing psychological warfare against Iran, but it still faces a serious problem. The more Iran consolidates its position in the Middle East, and the closer it is to a weapon, the more other countries outside the region will have to accommodate themselves to Iran. Certainly that leaves Israel in a very vulnerable position. Israel cannot do much about Syria, but a successful attack on Iranian nuclear facilities could undermine Iranian credibility at a time when Israel badly needs to do just that. Here again, Israel faces a strategic problem. It might be able to carry out an effective strike against Iran, particularly if, as has been speculated, a country such as Azerbaijan provides facilities like airfields. However, even with such assistance, Israel's air force is relatively small, meaning there is no certainty of success. Nor could Israel strike without American knowledge and approval. The Americans will know about an Israeli strike by technical intelligence. Hiding such a strike from either the Americans or Russians would be difficult, compounding the danger to Israel. But here's the real problem and why they would need to allow the U.S. to know what's going on, and that is, more important, Israel cannot strike Iran without U.S. permission because Israel cannot guarantee that the Iranians would not mine the Strait of Hormuz. Only the United States could hope to stop the Iranians from doing so, and the United States would need to initiate the conflict by taking out the Iranian mine-laying capability before the first Israeli strike. Given its dependence on the United States for managing its national security, the decision to attack would have to be taken jointly. An uncoordinated attack by Israel would be possible only if Israel were willing to be the cause of global economic chaos, and I don't think that's anywhere where they want to be. And also, I don't foresee that ever being the case. Israel's strategic problem is that it must align its strategy with the United States and with anyone the United States regards as essential to its national security, such as the Saudis. But the United States has interests beyond Israel, so Israel is constantly entangled with its patron's multiplicity of interests. This limits its range of action as severely as its air force's constraints do. Since its peace treaty with Egypt, Israeli dependence on outsiders was limited. Israel could act on issues like settlements, for example, regardless of American views. That period is coming to an end, and with it the period in which Israel could afford to deviate from its patrons. People frequently discuss any U.S.-Israeli rift in terms of personal relations between U.S. President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but this is a mistake. It is uncertainty in Egypt and Syria and the emergence of Iran that have created a new strategic reality for Israel. As I see the comments coming in, many people do believe that the relationship between the president and Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu sours or gets better, or whatever the case may be, and that's going to drive public policy between the two countries. But truthfully, that really has very little to do with it. The United States has an overall strategy that must be dealt with, and well beyond Israel, and many players are involved. So I wouldn't take that too personally when you see the reaction between the two presidents and what's going on. Now here's something else that I found interesting regarding this article, and it kind of speaks toward a popular belief that there will be a war in the latter days that will precede Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog war, which is known as Psalm 83 war. Many of the players that are involved in that, such as Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, they have one big problem, and I'm going to tell you about that in just a little bit. Anyone can look at a Bible verse and say, "Oh, you know what? This situation doesn't seem to have taken place, so therefore I am speculating that it's going to take place in the future." But you got to look at the facts on the ground in light of what you may believe, and sometimes two and two doesn't always seem to equal four, at least not in Bible prophecy. And let me tell you a little bit about that right here. In fact, let's talk about Egypt. Egypt is said to be one of the major players that will lead this attack against Israel, known as the Psalm 83 war. Now let me read a little excerpt from this particular article about Egypt. Egypt is the ultimate threat to Israel. It has a huge population, and as it demonstrated in 1973, it is capable of mounting complex military operations. But to do what it did in 1973, Egypt needed an outside power with an interest in supplying Egypt with massive weaponry and other support. In 1973, that power was the Soviet Union. But the Egyptians reversed their alliance position to the U.S. camp following that war. Once their primary source of weaponry became the United States, using that weaponry depended heavily on U.S. supplies of spare parts and contractors. And as you know, when Israel has the same problem, when they went to war with Hezbollah and Hamas in past wars, many believe that the wars ended not because Israel was tired of bombing them or felt that they had proven their point, but because the United States kind of cut off the supply line and would not supply any more spare parts, and therefore it kind of brought the Israeli military to a screeching halt. They couldn't afford to go on. Well, that same principle is being laid out here regarding Egypt, regarding Saudi Arabia, who just purchased a mammoth Air Force shipment and is going to take possession of I believe some F-15s in the very near future that Israel was worried about. But to me, I don't really worry about the United States supplying all of Israel's enemies with massive military supplies and equipment, because that gives them the power to cut off any one of these nations. They may send them 150 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia, and Egypt may get the same type of load. But the bottom line is that when they go to war, they'll be dependent upon the United States to continue to supply them. So if they go to war with the wrong country, the United States is not going to supply the massive amounts of spare parts and equipment that they're going to need in order to fight this war. Why? Why is this important? Because they are dependent. Their military now, they've basically turned over to their military to the United States, and they're at our mercy to make sure that we keep that military machine moving forward. So when you hear that the United States is sending such and such a country that seems to be an enemy of Israel, this amount of equipment or whatever the case may be, and this seems like it's highly sophisticated, I wouldn't fret too much, because that gives the United States an extreme amount of power to be able to control that war in any way they want to. Especially if it's against Israel or whatever the case may be. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries that depend heavily upon U.S. parts and equipment in order to fight these wars are at the mercy of the United States to be able to go forward. So that's why I have a problem with the Psalm 83 war. That's one of the reasons why I have a problem with the Psalm 83 war. Let me go ahead and continue reading this article. I'll pick up here. Once their primary source of weaponry became the United States, using that weaponry depended heavily on U.S. supplies and spare parts and contractors. At this point, no foreign power would be capable of or interested in supporting the Egyptian military should Cairo experience regime change and a break with the United States. And a breach of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty alone would not generate a threat to Israel. The United States would act as a brake on Egyptian military capabilities, and no new source would step in. Even if a new source did emerge, it would take a generation for the Egyptians to become militarily effective using new weapon systems. In the long run, however, Egypt will remain Israel's problem. Now, let me tell you what that means right there. Even if Egypt tomorrow decided that they were going to go ahead and move away from the United States and move to a different military source, it would take years upon years upon years for them to learn how to use this new weaponry and to switch over. It'd almost be like it's your business if you went from one software that ran your whole company, payroll and everything, and you all of a sudden, and this is a small scale example, but you all of a sudden decide, nope, we're going to change over to this other software, and we got to change it over completely. That means you'd have to have new personnel, you'd have to have training come in, you'd have to have maybe new PCs to handle the higher firepower. Then you'd have to have support after that. And continued support, and whatever the case may be. I mean, this is even on a much, much more grander scale, in which if you went to fight a war, you would have to have, you'd be dependent upon that new supplier to be able to supply you in the same fashion, the same way the U.S. did. And I don't think Egypt's willing to do that in any way. But what I'm trying to say is this right here, is that many are wondering why that Egypt and Jordan and some of these other countries, Saudi Arabia, are not mentioned in the battle of Gog and Magog. Well, there's a very good reason behind that. Their war machine is seriously dependent upon the United States to supply weaponry, supplies, and spare parts in order for them to go forward. And they wouldn't be able to go very far. Their war machine would grind to a halt if they got involved in a war of that nature. Well, others may say, well, what about Syria? Well, I have a hard time believing that Syria is not going to be involved in that war when Russia comes calling, because Syria does have a dependence upon the Russian military for their war machine, and so does Iran and some of the others. They're getting all their supplies, or much of it anyway, from these particular nations. But what I'm trying to say is this right here, is that these other nations, they depend on the United States. So that may be a better reason as to why they're not mentioned. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm just giving you something to think about and all. I mean, I'm sure that most of you are going to say, no, I like this other theory regarding Psalm 83 or whatever the case may be. Well, that's fine. Go ahead and do it. But the facts on the ground simply do not add up for that situation to go forward. And here's something else that was mentioned in the Stratfor report. I know that many believe that when the Psalm 83 war does take place, that Israel's going to automatically expand their boundaries well into Syria, well into Saudi Arabia, and Jordan and other nations. They're going to they'll massively take over all the many of these lands. But the question is how in the world are they, with a population of 7 million people and actually 5 million that they can actually trust, how are they going to control that land and occupy it? And here's what they said right. The only position or positive dimension for Israel is that Iran's military probably will not be able to deploy significant forces far from its borders for many years. Iran simply lacks the logistics or command capabilities for such an operation. But developing them is just a matter of time. Now, Israel could, of course, launch a war in Syria. But the challenge of occupying Syria would dwarf the challenge of Israel faces with the Palestinians. In other words, you think that the problem of occupying the Palestinian nation or the West Bank is a problem. compound that and add that to Syria. They just don't have the challenge of occupying Syria is just simply a situation that is just beyond their capability. With, like I said, 5 million trusted people, every available man, woman, and child would have to bear arms and to try to control the land that this Psalm 83 war supposedly projects. I simply, like I said, you can go ahead and you can live with what you believe is the truth. You think it's the truth, but the truth of the matter is that logistics on the ground simply don't add up. And sometimes you got to look at that and say, you know what, maybe this particular situation doesn't state that the Psalm 83 war will take place in these latter days. I don't know. I don't know what the truth is as far as that's concerned. Like I said, just because somebody writes a book doesn't necessarily make it true. I'm just trying to put that out there for you so you'll think about it. If you're looking for good, solid intelligence to support what you believe, then you need to look at this first and see what possibly could be the truth behind this situation. Again, I'm not blasting anybody or anyone's prophetic work or whatever the case may be, but I am saying that if you're asking me to adopt a certain belief that or interpretation of a particular verse, I have to look at all the facts that are involved. I'm not just going to look at a certain verse and say, okay. I mean, that's exactly what Scripture. You want to take all Scripture and make sure that it's possible, and that this is something that will take place. Many things would have to change in order for this Psalm 83 scenario to ring true. That's all I can say. I don't discount it. I don't rule it out. I'm just saying, listen, these are some of the facts that are on the ground that these are just the things that you must take into consideration before something of this magnitude can take place. This is Terry Malone with the Calvary Prophecy Report.